Alright guys, going to go through the menu setups on how to get this set up if you're doing kind of a film type of shoot. First of all, on top of the camera, right down here, kind of the cage kind of gets in the way, but you got your on switch on top of the GH5s, so I'm going to switch it to on. And you also want to make sure that your wheel on top is on the little camera film icon right there. That's the full manual setting for setting up video. And that's this wheel right up here. On switch and then rotate it to make sure it's on the film side. And I reset this back to default so I can show you guys how to set this up from like if you just pulled this out of the package and you're starting to use it. So, okay, so some things that we want to set up on this is dealing, first thing I want to do is set this up for full-on manual exposure. So I'm going to hit the display button, which is right here. I'm going to push that a couple times and see what sort of menu options it brings up. Right here, they're kind of limited options just because this camera, we're on some automated settings here. And if you want to do manual, most filmmakers will do things manually. So I'm just going to hit my display button until it brings up just the most amount of display icons here. And this is the nice thing about GH5, it's also touchscreen. Over here, you have your program auto, that little film camera there. If you click that, it will bring this up and ask you what exposure mode you want to. And I'm going to do fully manual exposure, because if you're filming, you don't want your camera to be irising down, or you don't want the shutter speed and the ISO constantly changing and the color temperature constantly changing. Because it's on automatic, you'll see those changes as you're filming. You'll see it get darker, you'll see the color temperature, you'll see it get brighter and darker as it automates the setting based on your environment. The three types of exposure that we're going to set manually are going to be shutter speed, iris or your f-stop, and the ISO. So let's start with ISO. Right here it says ISO is on auto. So I want to change that, and that's on top of the camera. So looking on top of the camera here, we have a few buttons. You got your white balance, you got your ISO. Those are two things that I'm going to do ISO first of all. I'm going to hit the ISO button, and it brings up these settings right here at the bottom of the screen. We have auto 160, 200, 400, and so on for ISO. So this is your sensor sensitivity. This will be really important when you are shooting, if you're shooting a film, and the way you light. 800 ISO is pretty standard ISO. If you go above that, supposedly the sensor starts getting noisier and the image starts kind of breaking apart. It loses its ability to record color when your ISO is cranked way up. But this is a dual native ISO, so this camera can handle. It kicks in automatically when you get up to a higher ISO. But if we're doing kind of film standard, anywhere from like 200 on it up to 800 is commonly used. 800 for ISO indoor, and the lower ISOs usually are outside. So since I'm indoor, I'm going to set my sensor sensitivity at 800 ISO. And generally speaking, ISO is used, the lower the ISO you have, the cleaner your image is going to be. And as you crank your ISO up, you typically start adding noise into your image. Let's go through the next thing, which is going to be shutter speed. Right here, your shutter speed is listed at 250. That's basically a fraction. That should be 1 over 250th. So every frame is being exposed for 1/250th of a second. So right now it's really dark and you're not really seeing anything. And you're not seeing much in front of the camera here because the shutter speed is so high. This little wheel right here works as your shutter speed. As you turn this wheel here, you see the shutter speed change. And I haven't set this up yet, but I'm going to be recording at 24 frames per second. Standard shutter speed for film is going to be half exposure time, which will be, if you're shooting 24 frames per second, that's going to be 1/48th of a second. This does not allow us to get to 1/48th. It just has 1/50th. So you can just move this wheel here. I'm going to get it the closest, which is going to be 1/50th. For those of you that are familiar with shutter angle, it's very similar. It's very similar to shutter speed. It has to do with the rolling shutter that's inside of a film camera, motion picture film camera, and it progressively exposes the film as a rolling shutter. Half the time it's exposing, half the time it's blocking the light, so it can move the film through the gate inside the camera without putting a big light streak across the film. And that's how film shoots, is with a shutter angle. You can change that by going into the menu settings. If you would rather have your camera show shutter angle rather than shutter speed, you can go into the first setting up here, which is the little manual camera setting here. I'm going to push the button and select, and we're going to scroll down to this little setting right here, shutter speed and gain operation. And gain is another word for ISO, basically boosting the sensitivity of your sensor. And right here, they're measuring your shutter speed by seconds, or a fraction of a second. Like I showed you, that 1 over 250 is 1/250th of a shutter speed. But I like angle. So I'm going to go to angle, and we'll describe the angle here. Angle basically, and we're going to measure by angle and ISO rather than what they call gain. It's pretty standard for film. So let's get out of that there. Here's your little back button that takes you back out of the menu. And right now my screen is really dark because the shutter angle is at 11. So what your shutter angle is in film you basically have two of these 180-degree plates that are pushed up against each other. And when you rotate a little knob on the camera, it offsets one of these. So when this thing is rotating right here, the angle changes and the amount of time that it's exposed. If you have a 90-degree angle, that's exposing it half the amount of time as 180 degree. And then if you cut that in half again, it's going to expose it for even another half of the time. So equivalent 180 degree at 24 frames per second is the equivalent of 1/48 in shutter speed. If you change it to a 90-degree shutter angle, that will be half of that, which is 1/96 of a second. So you keep cutting the exposure time in half. So 11 degrees, as you notice on there, was going to be a very small fraction of this circle, which is a very, very high shutter speed. And you're not exposing the film for very long. So that's the equivalent of these numbers here. So I'm going to use my little shutter scroll here to change my shutter angle. Right now, this is a very high shutter speed, basically 11 is 11 degrees, which is a lot less light that it's letting in. So I'm going to go to 180, which is standard for film. Like I said, it doesn't really make a difference if you use shutter angle. It's just kind of the math that goes into it. Using a physical shutter, rolling shutter, which this camera doesn't have, but it simulates that. Or you can just do shutter speed. It's going to be the exact same thing. 180-degree shutter angle is equivalent to 1/48 of a shutter speed per frame, just because we're going with half exposure time. Because film cameras have to block off the film for half the time, at least half the time, to get the film to move through the camera without exposing the entire strip. Okay, so we've got those two things set. And on this camera, I've got a manual iris, and with this camera, with these lenses specifically, I have these cine gears on them. So I've got my manual iris right here on the front, so I can change the f-stops or the t-stops. On these are the t-stops or the true stops. These ones are measured in t-stops. T-stops are essentially just like f-stops, but it's the actual amount of light that it's letting in, not the mathematical version of it. So the mathematical version. The mathematics of this would end up being slightly different than the t-stop, but this is the true amount of light that is coming into the camera, therefore t-stop rather than f-stop. And a lot of cine lenses are like that, where they have the actual t-stop because it's been the amount of light has been calculated for this specific lens here, and that stands at a 2.2. What your f-stop is a mathematical equation of how many times you can fit the size of your iris into your focal length. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens and the diameter of the aperture is at 25, that gives you basically a 2.0 because you divide 50 by 25. It's how many times that size of your iris can fit within your focal length. All right, and you do have here on the side some quick features. I'm just going to go into the menu because I know where these menu items are. A couple things I'm going to change here is this is your picture profile up at the top there, that little STD there with that little wheel. That is stands for your picture profile. And right now it's on the standard picture profile, which adds a certain level of contrast and a certain level of saturation. But I'm going to show you guys, I like to shoot in what's called log format. With this camera specifically, with Panasonic, it's called V-log. It's a very flat looking profile. It's not very contrasty, but it gives you higher dynamic range. So let's set that up. And one thing that I also want to set up here is the type of codec that I'm shooting in and the frame rate as well. So I'm going to hit my menu, and I'm going to go down one menu to this camera icon here, and I'm going to arrow to the right so I can get to the record format, and I'm going to select, and this is what really impressed me about this camera, is its ability to shoot internally at 422 10-bit. This is going to record in an MP4 format, whether or not it's in your MOV file. That's just basically what they call the wrapper or the extension is a .mov file. They tend to corrupt a lot less than MP4 files do, though. Sometimes the camera gets shut down while you're recording. The MOV file will still work, and MP4s will be corrupting. You have to find like some sort of repair tool, computer software repair tool to fix it. So I'm going to select MOV. A higher performance PC is required to play or edit. Yes, I know that. Thank you. Now we're going to go down to record quality here. Record quality is going to bring up your options. So many settings here as you've got at the top. So what this is going to do, it's got a whole bunch of different settings here for your resolution up at the top, which is right now, this is on 1920 by 1080. I'm going to go true 4K, and it's essentially 60 frames per second. And then down here you got 420. 420 is, by its very nature, is 8-bit. And then you've got your quality right down here is 100 megabytes per second. And this long GOP setting right there, the long GOP is a long group of pictures. This is another word for that is called intraframe. Intraframe encoding, which uses it borrows color information from specific frames and spreads it across several other frames. So it's not, this has fairly low color depth here. But if we want to go to 10-bit color, that is going to go from millions of different colors to literally billions of different colors. So it is exponentially larger and better quality as well. I'm going to show you the difference between kind of the something shot, what you kind of get in the, you'll end up seeing a lot of dark, noise in the darks on your image when you're shooting in 8-bit. It still does, it's pretty good quality still, but the best quality that I'm going to go for is going to be, this is UHD. They call it 4K on there. You can see on the screen that these little boxes up here, it technically calls it 4K, but it's not exactly 4K. It's 168 pixels shy of that, horizontally speaking. So I'm going to scroll up here until I get to my 4K set, my true 4K settings. Right here, 4096 by 2160. This aspect ratio is a little bit wider. It's a 1.89 to 1 aspect ratio, as opposed to a 16 by 9, which is more just like your regular computer screen. So this is going to be a little bit wider and a little bit more cinematic. And right there, 420, we do not want 420, we want 422. So I'm going to go for 20. So I'm going to keep scrolling up until I get to the all inter, all I, which means all inter. There we go. This is the settings that I want for filming. We've got our true 4K up here, which is a 1.89 to 1 aspect ratio, which is really nice. So that's cinematic there. We've got right there your frame rate, 23.98, which is essentially 24 frames per second. Move down to the codec compression here. This is 422 10-bit. So this is going to be the really nice high quality footage. It's going to eat up a lot of card space as well. If you're recording in something, if you're recording the long GOP version, the 8-bit color, you can record a lot more onto one card, probably fit like an hour and a half onto the card that I've got in here, as opposed to now I can only record about 20 minutes on this, but it's going to be higher quality. So 400 megabits per second, 10-bit, 422, all inter. This is what I really like about this camera, that it shoots that internally. Most cameras this size will not do that. They do a very compressed format, and then you can usually record 10-bit color out the HDMI port to an external monitor / recorder. So I'm going to select that, and we got our record settings all set. I'm going to hit back and get out. So now you can see the settings right here in the middle of the screen that we're set for our 422 all inter. And what the all I stands for is basically, that is all inter encoding. Interframe recording basically means every single frame has its own color data. Intraframe recording means that that other frames are borrowing the color information from a keyframe, from one frame within like 24 frames essentially. So that basically means that this codec is a lot better to color grade, because you have a lot of color latitude within it, and therefore you have a larger file as well, 400 megabits per second. Other thing that we want to set up right here is this little standard right there, the standard settings. That is how it treats. If you want to use the log setting, which is going to give you a higher dynamic range. Okay, so if we're going to change this to log, and it's going to look very flat, but it'll grade a lot better later on as well. So I'm going to hit the menu button, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in the second camera down there, not in the manual one, but the one right there. And on the very first page, you have at the bottom photo style, and that will be how to set up certain lights or looks to your image. If you want to have a lot of power over grading, I'd recommend shooting in log. So I'm going to select this, and now I'm going to scroll through these up here, and they've already got a bunch of presets. If you arrow back one time, it's the V-log. So look how that just got very, very flat, but it's going to maintain a lot of but it's going to have a higher dynamic range, which is great when you can't control light, like sunlight, and it's difficult to control the sunlight. This is a really good setting to shoot in here. But once again, it looks really flat for now, but then when you take it into your editing software, you can grade it, and you'll have a lot more control over it. So I'm going to menu out of that, hit my little back button, and now we are set on V-log. So we have up here, we've got our V-log is set. We got a resolution and codec set at 400 megabits per second. A couple other things I want to do here is I might want to turn on my peaking. If you're trying to find your peaking, if you hit menu, it's going to be under this wrench icon here. Also, if you got your card put in right now, you can format your card. You can select that, and it'll format your card and clean it off. So this is page 5 on that wrench icon there. So and with this button, you can either click up, left, right, down, or you can scroll it. Oops, I was wrong. It's actually the wrench. One more up right there with the C on it, the customization. And I'm going to arrow over, and then you're going to go to monitor display. So monitor display will have this little peaking option here on page number 4 within the monitor display options here. So page number 4, I'm going to go to peaking. It's already turned on by default, but I can go to set, and I'm going to make sure that this is on high level, and then I can choose a color. Since I'm probably going to want to use a lighter color since I'm in a room that has darker colors. So so that the contrast is good there. I'm going to hit the white switch right there, and you probably wouldn't want to use that outside. You'd probably want to use like red or something outside. Depends on what your environment looks like. So what this basically does, let's get out of our menu here, menu back to our main screen. This helps you know what is in sharp focus. And you can see those little kind of dancing pixels right there. See, right there, that just means that these items over to the right here, are in sharp focus. You got that peaking. If you want to get the heaviest, whatever you're trying to focus on, you want to get the heaviest concentration of those dancing pixels. See right there, we've gone past it. Right here is it like in really good sharp focus right there. Get the highest amount of those kind of dancing pixels. And if I go out of focus, notice now everything is soft. So that's going to help you with focusing, especially on this little teeny monitor. Oftentimes I like looking into the eyepiece just to test focus to make sure you're on the best focus possible. If you put your face up to this, notice how the screen blanks out by default because it thinks that your eye is looking inside the little viewfinder here. So and you can see that the monitor inside the viewfinder turn on and off as well as I take my finger away. So see, there we go. Now you can see inside. That thinks that's my eye right there. So you can see that light in there. The LCD is on inside the screen there. And you also have a little diopter on the side here. This got this little wheel on the side right here. You move this up and down, and it will change focus for your eyes. So it'll make the monitor come and focus on your eyes like it would do with any DSLR or mirrorless camera. Usually has, especially mirrorless cameras. Mirrorless cameras has an LCD built in here, and you can move that knob up and down to get it focusing to your eye. Okay, so let's talk about metering as well. Right here, you have a little light meter that's next to your ISO settings there. And it starts at 0 and goes to -3. And that is 3 stops underexposed right there. And when you're shooting log, it's good to shoot slightly overexposed. So I usually recommend about 1 to 2 stops overexposed on your light meter there. And right now, it is saying I'm about 1 stop underexposed for what this is metering. And the way you change your meter mode is you go into menu, determine what it is metering. We're going to go under the second camera down there. And then on page 2, and here, let me arrow over to the right to get into this menu, you have your metering mode. And this determines how, you've got 3 little settings here. One is a spot meter. That's going to add a little spot right in the middle, like we can show you there. I'm going to select that, get out of that. And basically, that's going to give you a measurement for this little teeny spot right there in the center, that little dot right there. And you can change what's metering here by double tapping your screen. It brings this thing up here. And then you can tell it where you want that measurement to be on your screen. And then that will change your meter will change depending on where you position that on your screen. And tap to get out of that, double tap to get out of that. And now you can see that I've changed the position of that little square there, and you got that little teeny dot in the middle, and now it's metering for that specific spot right there. But typically speaking, I keep it on this one right here. This is more center weighted. This is more of like a multi-view that's kind of getting more of the metering for the overall screen, but right here is kind of center weighted, but it's doing kind of a general area in the middle of the camera there. So if you got a subject going, that's the best one to have it on, and then you can tell what exposure is going to be. Right here, right now, it says I'm the center weighted measurement. The center weighted meter is giving me that, and that's just kind of here, kind of like measuring kind of a big circle in the middle there, as if somebody's face is sitting out here in front of the camera, and that's what it's metering right there. See, now it's saying with my hand, when I put my hand in front of the screen, it says that I'm slightly over 0, which is slightly overexposed, not even quite by a full stop, by like maybe half a stop of light. See, now when I take my hand away, the center weight goes to the wood on the piano there, and that's measuring the light exposure on the center of your image there. And I've got one other thing to set up, and it does not show it on the screen right now because it's in auto white balance mode. So it's going to detect if there's warmth or coolness in your image, and it's going to adjust your image so it looks balanced, so it looks properly color balanced, depending on if it's reading a high level of warmth or coolness in your light, depending on what light source you're working under. So I'm going to hit the white balance button. The white balance button is found on the top over here next to the ISO button. So there's the WB. You see that WB down there? I'm just going to push that WB. That's white balance. It brings it up, and it's going to tell us, we're going to tell the camera what sort of light we're shooting under. And in this room, I'm under incandescent light, which is very warm. If you're shooting outside, you'll want to put this on the sun. Diffuse lighting with lots of clouds and it's overcast, you can choose a cloud. You can do it if you're shooting in the shade. That is an incandescent bulb right there, so that's the color temperature that I'm shooting under. If you want to dial in your own Kelvin, you can set these here for specific Kelvin colors. So I can really control these based on Kelvin here. I can, if you arrow up, it'll enter that setting. Arrow up will enter that setting, and you can tell this what you want it to be programmed at. I'm going to set this for sunlight. So I'm going to arrow up and go to 5600. 5600 is standard film for outdoor temperature. I'm going to hit set, and it's now set that one at 5600. You can see that over here. It's set at 5600 now. Oops. So I'm going to go to my second one here. I'm going to set my second, and I'm going to arrow up, and it will enter the settings here, and I'm going to set this one for incandescent. I'm going to arrow down and get to 3200. 3200 is standard indoor color temperature for incandescent lighting, kind of the warm lighting, especially if you're doing like for film lights. If you're using incandescent lights, which are the old-fashioned bulb ones, they tend to have more of a warmth to them. In fact, I've got LEDs in here in my house, but they are burning at 3200 though. They're intentionally made those bulbs warmer than the cooler, warmer over cooler. So I'm going to do a couple other settings here. I'm going to maybe set this one for fluorescent lighting, which hits around 4000. So if you're like in a big building, like a big business area, that they are likely using fluorescents in those buildings there, and I'm setting it at 4000. And then I have one more here I can probably do for shade. Sometimes shade shade hits around like 6000 to like 6600-ish, kind of in that arena. So I'm going to make this preset for doing the shade here. So yeah, it says here that overcast hits around 6300, and then the shade hits around, looks like, around 7000. So a little higher than 7000. So I'm going to set this one for around 6300 for overcast. And now I've got 4 settings here, and I can dial these in. Look at the color temperature change as I scroll through these. We've got the first one, which is 5600 for outside, 3200 for indoor, 4000 for fluorescent, and 6300 for shade. So I can quickly choose these things, one of these options here. And since I'm indoor, I'm going to set it for 3200. Okay, I am fairly set on this. Now when you're recording, if you want, you can actually just hit your display button right here and get all these items off. Just make sure that your camera is set up properly before you start shooting. Now I can hit my button up here on the handle, hit record, and it records, and we're recording our image. Stop the recording. Okay, next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take the camera outside. I'm going to shoot some footage, some test footage, do some low light tests, and come back and show you the footage.